All right, everybody, Kris Gethin here, and welcome to another episode of the Knowledge and Mileage podcast. The person that I'm speaking to today is the author of the book that I just finished reading in LA last week, Radiation Nation, The Fallout of Modern Technology. Now, I know a lot of you have seen me online, and you all think that I'm a little bit woo-woo because I'm wearing a Defender Shield blanket, and I've got the cover on my phone that blocks a lot of their EMF rays or scrambles a lot of those EMF rays that we all hear about, especially with the introduction of 5G. And we'll talk about that a little bit later within this podcast. That person that is on the other end of the line here is Daniel T. DeBorn. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I appreciate you tuning in from Tampa, Florida. We've been trying to get this interview going on for a while, so I'm glad it finally happened.
Hey, Kris, thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I think we're going to be able to chat a bit about things that are going to be interesting to your audience. So I'm excited to get started.
Yeah, it's going to be good to get someone else's viewpoint, because I know a lot of my followers are, kind of hardcore bodybuilders. They're more interested in how I can explain to them how to build their biceps than, build the strength of our heart, for instance. But I'm very cognizant and wary about my health in all aspects. I spend, 5-6 days a week in the sauna, collating, detoxing, hot and cold therapy, and doing everything that I possibly can to heal my future and not harm it. Okay, I may want to look good because it makes me feel good, but weight training for me is very therapeutic. And one of the things I've been very cognizant about as well is EMF exposure. A lot of people don't know if it really exists. It doesn't exist. However, I take it that one step further. And I'll just start this podcast by explaining one thing to you. I was at a music festival. It's like an electronic music festival recently in Las Vegas. Now, I wasn't drinking, wasn't exposed, doing a lot of drugs or anything like that. However, when I left that place, I went into like a deep depression. Not a huge deep depression, but I was in a depression there for like 3 or 4 days. And I felt tired. I felt like I had an electronic hangover. That's all how I can describe it, because like I said, it was an electronics festival, is in Las Vegas. The reception on anybody's phone did not work because there was that many of us in a short space. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and explain to our listeners what EMF is?
Before I do that, I want to respond to what you said. The fact is, there's direct correlation to body performance with exposures to emissions. It turns out that your body gets influenced dysfunctionally, and in your space, it's extremely important that when you tear down muscle, you build up muscle. Muscle's built up when you sleep.
Yeah.
So that disruption occurs, and we'll talk about this in detail, but it occurs when you have electromagnetic radiation around your environment. My background is simple. I worked for the Bell System for over 30 years. I ran the technical laboratories that analyze technology that's all around us. Great story, about 6-7 years ago, my boys were visiting me, and they had their laptops on their lap. And my wife says, "I want grandchildren, get it off your lap." And I thought to myself, that can't be. The levels of emission that they were exposed to was extremely low. How could that possibly affect them? So because I sort of understand the research side of stuff, I went and began investigating. And to my surprise, within the first 3 or 4 hours, back then we knew that the sperm could be 25-30% immobile. So there was a direct correlation to influencing the cells of the body to the procreation of the next generation. So I took my knowledge of emissions with all the testing I had done for all those years, and I began building products to protect my children. Literally, that's how I started 6-7 years ago. And I found that there was a lot of research that cautioned us about emissions, electromagnetic radiation, and no one knew about it. I certainly didn't know about it. And I was in the business, the telecommunications business. So, what is it? Every time you use your cell phone, every time you use your laptop, every time you use a Wi-Fi, every time you use a TV multiplexer, Apple TV, all of them use RF transmitters to communicate to something else. Cell phone uses cell towers. Your tablet uses Wi-Fi. And those are transmissions that are beginning to accumulate in your environment and you're not even aware. Those are the sources of emissions that we want to talk about today. And if you think about it, when you have a cell phone in your hand, you have the Bluetooth emission transmitting from the cell phone. You have the Wi-Fi transmitting from the cell phone. You have the GPS being transmitted. So from that one piece of equipment, you have 3 transmitters in your environment. When you have it really close to you, not so good. When it's farther away, you're much better. So you really got to know your environment. And again, it's pretty important for you guys because you need your sleep, you need a circadian rhythm, you'll be able to have to recover, and there's a lot of things that you can do in your environment to minimize the exposure. And you particularly, your body has already responded to mold, for example. It already responds. It responds identically to exposures. So when you say to me, you're having a problem sleeping, it's literally the same mechanics of your body that's responding to the environment you're in. So let's talk about some of that.
Yeah, and it is interesting. Just because somebody is very sensitive to something, a lot of people will look down upon that and say, well, this doesn't exist. So before we came on live here, Daniel and I were talking about that I had to go to a clinic for about 6 weeks due to mold toxicity. And I obviously have a sensitivity to this, as does Dave Asprey as well. And so I have to be very wary of the types of foods that I have because of the possible mold toxicity within your grains, within your coffee, within your wine, etc. And my DNA labs show as well that Dr. Anthony J took a deep dive upon that I do have a lot of these sensitivities, a lot of light sensitivities. So what may be very sensitive to me may not be other people. But like you said, people within the fitness industry and the health industry are very attuned to their body. And it's important that we do release that melatonin before we go to sleep. So, you know, I do try to stay away from artificial light for a good couple of hours before bed. If not, I'm blocking that with blue light blocking glasses. I do have these clear glasses that I'm wearing right now, actually, that I use when I'm on the computer during the day. Sometimes it's the yellow, sometimes it's the red, dependent on that. And we have the photoreceptors on our skin as well. So I try to cover up as well because I have that sensitivity. Some people don't, and they just sleep straight away. Now, with, for instance, you know, you said we've got the cell phone, we've got it to our ears, we have the earbuds now that's putting the Bluetooth into our ears as well. And one thing that has kept coming up, I do subscribe to a lot of research websites like Science Daily, etc., that you'll see correlations with children and obesity. And they say part of that is the exposure to their phone because it kind of gives people or children an endorphin fix when they look at their phone and they get that blue light penetrating their retina and being exposed to the EMF rays. Are there any studies? What are the most recent studies that have shown this correlation with like children and the exposure to EMFs? Because I know that they are much more sensitive or can be than adults.
I'm going to answer that in a minute, but let me explain a little bit before I get there so you have a sense of what's going on.
Sure.
Back in the late 80s, the cell phone industry standards were established how strong can a transmitter be for a cell phone? The way in which it was determined by the FCC was they took the top 10% database of servicemen and they said, how much of a signal should penetrate a man's skull? 6-foot average man, over 200 pounds. So they came up with, let's not let that signal go inside the head more than 1 inch. We won't let the signal heat up more than 2 degrees. So 1.6 watts per kilogram was the FCC standard. That was done in the late 80s. 1.6 watts per kilogram is not a hell of a lot of signal. However, it penetrates your head by about 1 inch and it heats it up by 2 degrees. What does that mean? When you go to use a microwave oven and you put a piece of meat inside a microwave oven, it's about 2.3 gigahertz. That's the frequency speed of the signal. When you use a microwave, a cell phone, it's about 2 watts, 2 gigahertz. It's about the same frequency. So when you have a microwave cooking your meat, it's heating up the water between the cells, oscillating the cells, and it's cooking. Guess what? It's the same frequency, lower power level, but it's literally heating your head by 2 degrees with that mechanic. That's the thermal impact, not the biological. The standards never address biological. So when you have a cell phone to your head, they talk about 2 degrees heating up. For your head, a child, it goes completely through. 5-year-old child, completely through. Heats the child's head completely through. We're not talking about the biological impacts. Almost all study that we know today is around the biological, because the thermal is not the problem, it's the constant use biologically. And for a child, we know through study work, as I just mentioned, that goes right through their head, it heats up the head, and there's potentially long-term impacts to neurological response, physiological response. There's so many potential impacts. To make it even worse, the nature of the signal not only heats your cell up, but in your head, when you're using it, it suppresses your blood-brain barrier. So when your blood-brain barrier is down, it's not protecting the brain. We know from research, 0.1 watts per kilogram, 0.1 watts, which is 15 times less the strength of a cell phone, can mutate the frontal lobe brain cell.
Wow.
Imagine having that for a child at 6 years old as they're going to an adult. That's the problem. We really don't know enough through practice to know what the ultimate long term will be, but we certainly have a lot of research and data that's telling us it's not necessarily a very good thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why you are more susceptible to others than others are. Subsequently, I think it's still premature to talk about it, but let's talk about sort of the general stuff, and then we'll talk a little bit about oxidative stress and all the kinds of impacts, particularly for you guys. I think it's
well, that's a perfect segue. Let's go straight into that. You know, because obviously the majority of my demographic are doing this. You know, follow the same sort of lifestyle as myself. You know, I do participate in weight training. However, I do consider myself a hybrid athlete. I compete in Ironman triathlon, so I'm always in a state of trying to prioritize my recovery, because I know my recovery is going to dictate my performance. But as I said, you know, I really want to think about my longevity, my health span, but I want to kick ass while I'm on this earth at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And your goal is always to optimize your body for the highest performance. And so you have to be aware of all the variables in your environment that influence that health. When you talk about what happens to the body, we already know through a lot of research, particularly recently, that the cell responds by going into, you may have heard, oxidative stress.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, oxidative stress simply says, hey, something's happening. I'm not sure I want to talk to my neighbor cell, so it starts dysfunctioning. In your case, science calls it CDR, cell danger response. Your cell actually said, I don't like the mold in my environment. I'm going to start protecting myself by putting my cell in a protective state. So all of a sudden, your body's now reacting to all toxins in the same way. So the CDR response is something that really you want to minimize because it's disrupting cell function. Now, why is that important? Mitochondrial function of the cell is really important for you. You start screwing around with putting oxidative stress or CDR to the cell, it's hard to recover. It's not recovering to where it needs to be. And the mitochondrial cell is not recovering, which is the engine of the body, as you know, is now being hampered. What's hampering it? It's not just the direct connection to the body, but it's also, I'd like to point out, you're using glasses, right, to cut the blue light out. Why is that important? It's connected to a bunch of stuff in the brain. You're really protecting the window into the brain. And when you look at blue light, well, let me explain what blue light is. Blue light is an a visible electromagnetic radiation. When I talk about electromagnetic radiation for a cell phone, it's around 2 gigahertz. When I talk about the X-ray, it's in the terahertz space. In the middle is the visible stuff, but it's electromagnetic radiation. That's going directly into your eye, and it's influencing common functions within the brain. And so it's disrupting your brain sleeping pattern. Why? Because it's suppressing the creation of melatonin. It's literally saying, I'm not going to produce it yet because I'm not supposed to be in a sleep cycle. And so you're slowing down the sleep cycle the way it should be in a circadian rhythm function. Why is that a problem? Because as I said in the start, your body has to rebuild. It does it at night. If you don't sort of understand your environment, you actually can have a brain function where the waves are in the sleeping mode during the day because it's now being so disrupted, it's trying to fix itself during the day. So very important to try to watch your environment, very important to minimize the exposures because in your case, there could be difficulty in recovering the cell's performance.
Yeah, and I see that all the time with clients and people in general, where sleep issues are huge now, where they never used to be a problem. When I grew up in Wales on a farm, everyone used to sleep at night and wake up early in the morning and feed the animals, and that was it. But including myself, there's so many people that are having problems with their sleep, which can lead, and it did with me, lead to depression, anxiety, stress, anger. And I've said this many times, if I look at the content and books that I wrote back in 2013, 14, I'm like, who was that person? Because I pat myself on the back for having no sleep and being a warrior and still kicking butt in the gym and burning a candle at both ends and running a couple of businesses. but it affected me mentally, and it
Oh,
affected
yeah.
my state. And, you know, it can cause indirectly a form of insulin resistance, because, you know, you get that afternoon slump and you go for the sugar or the carbohydrates and, you know, the meal frequency just to keep your energy up. And it definitely can turn into a vicious circle. So in regards to like the EMF and the safety standards that we are governed by, like what are they at the moment? You know, and I think back, and I've heard you talk about, and I read you know, your book, obviously, Radiation Nation, where you talked about the tobacco industry.
Yeah.
Back when, you know, because I remember that time when you'd see it advertised, you know, on TV, everyone in the movies was smoking, but there wasn't anything that would say this is harmful as we see it now. You know, what are the safety standards that we are correlated with today with EMF?
I want to go back to the smoking thing.
Let's do it, yeah.
That's a really important point. When I was 12 years old, I'm a little older than you are, I used to smoke cigarettes. 12 years old, I was a big guy. I snuck them, you know, when I bought the cigarettes. And at that time, research knew there was a direct link between smoking cigarettes and cancer of the lung. At that time, there was no way that was public domain stuff. It took 30 some odd years before we put something on the side of a box of cigarettes and said, yeah, this may kill you. They knew it all along. So it took many, many years of that in our environment before ultimately it ended up being something considered dangerous to our health. And you're right, I use that parallel all the time. We're starting, over the last 10 years or so, that's really where this stuff has come into our life. When I had 20 years ago, I had a cell phone, I didn't have anybody to call because none of my friends had phones, right? Your 6-year-old son and daughter have cell phones calling their friends. I mean, it's becoming so pervasive. So we really don't have much experience, but we know the trending is occurring where we do have more and more. In fact, a bit more scientific. The National Toxicity Program was a study done by the government, ended 2 years ago. And it was an epidemiology study. And they looked to see if you're exposed, what would happen? And they had a group that wasn't exposed and a group that was. There was a statistically significant increase in frontal lobe cancer and heart cancers from the cell phones. And the group that weren't exposed were much lower or lower. That was substantiated by another study, Rabazzani study out in Italy, which was a consortium of researchers in Europe. They came to the same conclusion and their same somewhat identical epidemiology. So the debate about is it dangerous or not to the cell is somewhat being pretty clearly understood these days in the scientific community, not the general public, but the scientific community is getting pretty soft. And there are thousands of studies all over the world that are reinforcing those kind of responses. But believe it or not, I'm not so worried about the cell breakdown. Although, by the way, frontal lobe cancer has increased over the last 10 years by 2% compounding every year. Frontal lobe cancers. Is there, you know people, I'm sure, that had cancer of the brain.
Yeah.
Frontal lobe. It's happening all over. So
and breast cancer as well.
Breast cancer. Yeah. Doctor, I put my cell phone near my breast. And look, I have cancer now. There's a direct correlation. We know all this thing. I'm more worried about sort of the response you had to mold when you had a hypersensitivity to a toxin. It's a volatile organic compound, as they call it. The problems with when you went to the movie conference, you felt bad. Well, guess what? Electromagnetic radiation begins interfering with brain function. The fact that you felt foggy brained, maybe, the fact that you felt that you were getting angry, all of those are direct correlation to electromagnetic radiation exposures. And those are increasing. Psychological more and more kids are getting more and more emotional issues. That's been correlated to studies, but they're not statistically significant. You know what I mean? Statistically significant means the population is so big that we study that if we conclude something, we know it's right. Most of the studies have been with very small groups, 100, 200 people, and they find these observations, but it's not statistically significant. And by the way, that's why the NTP and the Ramazani were, because they were statistically significant. So having neurological impacts, psychological, having insomnia issues, they're all being contributed, assigned to those kinds of increased exposures. In fact, the way I like to think about it is 1 bee won't bother you, won't kill you. 1,000 will. When we were talking before about your cell phone, we talked about 3 transmitters just from your cell phone. You may have a tablet. You may have a Wi-Fi 10 foot away from you. They're all bees in the room, all in the same room you're in. So it's the what they call the ambient is literally increasing. There was 20 years ago, no ambient in your environment. Today, in a school, it can be 5 watts of ambient. That's 1/3 the strength of a cell. All day while kids are in school. So our environment's evolving, and it's more and more becoming part of our lives.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You know, like I mentioned when I went to that music festival, it's not as if that's the first time I've been to a music festival. I've been to one every year since '92. However, this is the first time I've actually been to one in this. It was in it's in the Speedway. It's within a stadium, and then you left it to go straight into Las Vegas on the Strip, and then back out. And you know, that's the only thing that I could kind of correlate it to, because I hadn't experienced it at any other festival, and I've been to one since then. So let me ask you, you know, like when you go to someone's home and you see that they've got a TV on in every room, they got a couple of Wi-Fi routers, they got probably 2 or 3 computers, they're on the cell phone. Does that freak you out at all? And you want to get out of there?
Yeah, I go nuts, because I in fact go buy Ethernet cords, and I go to their router and plug it in, and I plug in their devices that use Wi-Fi that don't need to. When you use your cell phone, at most of the time, all you're doing is touching a transmitter outside. So why do you have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on? You don't need those transmitters. And when they're on, move it 3 or 4 foot away, and you're pretty safe. You know, knowing your environment and trying to reduce the exposures by minimizing the transmitters in the room is the way you begin addressing the problem. And it really is significant. I want to mention something about what you said before about sleep. I was on a podcast, and I was talking to a brilliant lady, and I said, you got to take everything out of your bedroom. And she was being very polite. Oh, yes, we need to do that. I said, get your cell phone out, move your clock away. You don't need it in your bedroom. And she was very polite, but she wasn't believing what I was saying. She called me back about 3 or 4 weeks later, and she said, Dan, my husband and I are sleeping. That little bit of transmission in the room was disrupting my sleep. And that makes a lot of sense. And so It really does make an impact.
So what do you suggest then? Because like a lot of people in this day and age, not only do they work from home, if they don't work from home, you can pretty much guarantee that they've got computers at home, laptop at home, Wi-Fi routers at home. Do you suggest then that people just remove themselves of that Wi-Fi connection and have analog? You know, because I know our friends like Dr. Joseph McCullough, Ben Greenfield, Ben Pekoski, now they have analog basically routed through their house. Is this something that you suggest? And if so, how does someone go about doing that?
Um, what I always suggest is turn the Wi-Fi component off your routers. You don't need them. Connect with an Ethernet cord to your computer. You don't need the Wi-Fi from your computer. And by the way, I have a setup right now where I'm talking with you. I have a laptop. I have an Ethernet cord to the laptop. I have it about 2 foot away from me. I have a monitor about 1.5 feet away. And so I've minimized the exposure of the technology. I haven't necessarily eliminated it, but I, by and large, eliminated the likely influence to my body by simply arranging it around the room. So when you get an Apple TV, plug it into a router. Don't use the wireless piece. That minimizes the bees in the room. Anytime you can eliminate the use of a transmitter, you want to do it, and you want to reduce it. And if you have it on, simply move it away from you. So in general practice, like people go crazy about smart meters. If a smart meter is on your garage wall, you have a 2-car garage in between, and your bedroom is on the other side of the house, why would you worry about it? The distance is so much that you've eliminated any danger from that transmitting smart meter. On the other hand, if you have it on the outside wall of your bedroom, move your bedroom, because there's no question it's going to influence your sleep at night.
Okay.
You know, there's rules that you worry about.
So if people were to have the internet cables put into their house so they could use their laptop around the house, like is this like a costly procedure? I assume electrician will have to come in and put in these plugs.
Yeah, exactly. It's really not a big deal. It's fairly easy to do. When you run your cable, I'm getting new cable service, they come in and they run a wire. Well, you'll run a couple of wires. Electricians can easily run CAD6 kind of Ethernet wire that's shielded, and any of the high-speed data you want, you can get. You don't need the Wi-Fi, and you reduce the exposure. Another one of the reasons it's important is you are responding to mold. You will get worse in time in exposures. When you have a CDR response, it accumulates as you age. It gets worse as you age. So you really want to make sure that to maintain the resilience of your body, you manage those exposures, including all toxins. The chemicals that you have in the environment will bother you in time because you're hypersensitive to volatile organic compounds. So you really want to spend the time not worrying only about the electrical components in in your house, but all the others as well, as you do.
Yeah. Now, are you aware of Anne Louise Gittelman?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was at Anne Louise's 70th birthday recently. Fantastic lady.
Yeah.
And I've had her on the show before. And from what I recall, she came out with a book many years ago called Zapped, where she spoke about EMF radiation. This is going back quite a while. And she told me that she's thinking about possibly writing another book now with the introduction of 5G that is coming up. So can you explain, because there's some people out there that doesn't think that 5G actually exists. and it's not actually being introduced as we speak. Can you speak to that and kind of explain what this is and what people can expect?
Okay, so remember we spoke about radio frequency, the cell phone connections around 2 gigahertz. 2 gigahertz. Remember the number 2. We know that your immune system is being suppressed, your blood-brain barrier is being reduced at 2 gigahertz. So all the data we have, we know, and it's accumulating, that there's no question that the trending is it's going to get worse before it gets better. So we know that at 2 gigahertz. With that, there's a digital signal that travels in those signals. It's an on and off, on and off, on and off. And so when you talk about a cell responding to a cell phone close to the head, for example, it's on and off. It's hitting it on and off, on and off. And you may want to think about that as if I was building a concrete wall, a floor, and I took a 10,000-pound load on a piece of metal, and I put it statically on the metal, I wouldn't break the concrete. If I lift it up and down, it will break the concrete. So it's a jackhammer-like function when you begin putting digital data and putting it on a signal that's going to the head. 5G is very different than all of these things. With a RF cell phone transmission, it can go up 4 to 5 miles. It goes a long way. With 5G, the speed goes up to and including 300 gigahertz, 300 billion cycles per second. 300 billion cycles per second. Now it's really, really, really fast. And that's what the FCC has approved. Most over the next year or two are going to be between 30 and 60 gigahertz. Nowhere in research or science has anybody investigated the body response to those frequencies. Nobody. So if someone says that you're perfectly safe, they're a liar. If someone says you're perfectly in danger, they're a liar. Nobody knows. We literally don't know. But if you look at the trending, we spoke about RF before, that's increasingly worse. What we suspect about the oxidative stress level of a cell, the CDR response to the environment, will escalate farther than it is today. The neurological impacts, the psychological impacts, all of the other stuff, headaches, tingling in the hands, sleep disorders, infidelity, cancers, behavioral issues, all of those things may be influenced even further when you begin increasing the RF signal. This is what we know. Your biome in your gut, that's pretty important for you and what you do. Even more so is the leaky gut. It's very important to minimize leaky gut and be aware that it is to maintain health. We know biome, or the bugs in the stomach, have a more grand time as you increase the frequency. They love it more than we do. So there's likely to be an increased mix of biome that hasn't existed in the past. Is that a good thing or bad thing? Well, I don't know. I would predict it's not a good thing. When you're extremely hypersensitive, it can be as debilitating as literally putting you in a wheelchair. I work with a facility, the K2 Pinnacle Health Clinic in Portland, and they treat hypersensitive. And we know through that clinic work, they are direct links that can be extremely debilitating, emotionally, functionally, all those things. I expect those problems to increase. So the impact to you getting mad or not will increase. Whoever your mate will be bothered more with you than in the past. Most likely. We don't fully know. What I do know is at 90 gigahertz, if you were protesting on my block and I bought my machine that was an electronic machine in crowd control, they use a 90 gigahertz signal and they direct it towards your body in crowd control. And what happens at 90 gigahertz, your sweat glands act as an antenna. So it resonates with the signal and you feel like you're burning up. So I know from research that at 90 gigahertz, it's really not a good thing. Any exposure is not a good thing. Everything in between, we really don't have enough evidence to say that it's of extreme danger, but all prediction by all the experts are saying it's not good. Now, should we worry? Apple just announced 5G transmitters in all their cell phones next year. So their next generation will have 5G. Samsung already offers it, not in the US, but in other parts of the country. Now, I want to go back to the discussion we had about the jackhammer. When you talk about the signal for RF with a cell phone today, it goes, 3-4 miles. Because the speeds are going higher and higher, you'll have to have a transmitter 750 feet away from your house, no more. So every 750 feet, you're going to have multiple bees that never existed. And they're going to be at 20 watts per channel. A cell phone 5 miles away is 60 watts. So all of a sudden, you have a whole lot of power that drops off really, really fast in 750 feet. Let's say you're in the living room and it's right next to the driveway, right next to the pole that's been put up with a Wi-Fi transmitter. And you have a son at the far end in his bedroom. That signal is going right through you to him. It's directional and it's MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. That means they're using 2 streams of data to the end source. So your cell phone has 2 streams of signals, on and off, on and off, on and off. So that's twice the load a cell uses today. Is that a problem? I think so. But I can't tell you for sure because there's been literally no research. So when the FCC says, oh, we don't need to test, what are you kidding me? This is something that's never existed in our environment. And at the very least, we should spend time trying to understand what's impact to our bodies. So 5G is an experiment that's in real time, and it's going to be fairly pervasive next year.
So I'm trying to paint this picture. Of course, we know what cell towers look like, and they're, in comparison, they're few and far between. If these cell towers or these transmitters are going to be, 700 within 750 feet of us, like what does that look like? Are we going to have cell towers that we can visibly see in our streets?
Yeah. Now, a cell tower that you're thinking about on the traditional cell towers, they're fairly large, and they put hundreds of them typically on a tower, and you can see them in the distance. These are going to be little boxes. They're going to be in your right of way. So your telephone pole will have this little box. Your lighting, outside lighting, will have this little box. They'll be transmitting many transmitting signals from that, trying to serve all applications, moving cars, Internet of Things. That's where supposedly 5G allows us to talk to everything anytime we want. Ask our refrigerator, do you have milk? I don't care about having milk. So the Internet of Things seems to be looking for an application because I'm pretty comfortable with the communications I have. But now I have a cell tower literally 750 feet away from me, and I don't know the consequences of it.
Yeah, it seems crazy that we don't actually have a choice, that there isn't a survey that goes out to ask for our opinion, whether we want it or not. It seems like, we should be given that choice. But it's funny, I actually, of all people, I had my father on my podcast about 6 weeks ago when I was in Wales, because I found it fascinating based on a conversation that we had when he was talking about when he was a kid growing up on a farm in Wales. There was obviously no telephone then.
Right.
There was only heating in the kitchen, and the communication was basically, on a bit of paper, or you communicated with somebody and you just planned to meet them. That's it. But today, we complain if the internet has gone down or if it's not quick enough and we don't have that access, or if we go into a restaurant and they, God forbid, they tell us that they don't have Wi-Fi. It's funny how we're always demanding more and more. And there seems like to be like a sense of entitlement now. It's like we want something more convenient, quicker, and delivered now. If I order it today, it needs to be delivered tomorrow. And I actually spoke to somebody from the UK earlier today where they heard a conversation where two people were in bed on a Saturday morning and they called like Uber Eats, and within 15 minutes they were eating McDonald's in bed. Crazy. As crazy as that sounds, we are creating, I guess, the biggest terrorist act in the world on ourselves, by choice. So what can people do? Obviously, we cannot eliminate this. What can people do to mitigate the exposure with their cell phone, in their house, in their environment right now? Like, before I go into that, I'll just bring it up that I put up a post of myself flying. I can't remember. I travel a lot. So that is the only time that I actually really use the blanket, the Defender Shield blanket. When I'm on a plane and I cover myself, I've got the blue light blocking glasses and everything but the foil hat, I guess. But that's when I use that, because I'm I want you to talk a little about the exposure to people that travel as well. But what can people do to mitigate when they're inside of their home and outside of it?
Because you're electrical hypersensitive, when you put that on your body, your body is a capacitor, by the way. It absorbs energy, and you absorb an excess level of energy. When you put that on you, I bet you feel calm.
Yeah, I do. I sleep better. One of the things that I notice is that when I come back to wherever I'm going or whatever that time zone is, I sleep good. And that was something that was definitely a problem with me. I'll do other things. I'll ground myself. I'll find a grassy patch and try to earth myself as well.
So, Ken, you've heard me talk about throughout the time so far a couple of things. Distance being one. When you have a cell phone to your head, that's when it's most dangerous. When you're 1 to 2 foot away, 80% of that danger is gone. By 4 foot, 92% is gone. So by taking a transmitter and simply putting it farther enough away from your body, you really reduce the potential impact to the body because of that.
So using the speakerphone, for instance, as a welded to your head.
Very simple things to do. The next thing you worry about is duration. If you use a cell phone to your head and it's over in 5 minutes, you don't worry about it. The cells are not going to go nuts because you had a duration of time of a few minutes. It's when you are hours at a time that it becomes more and more of a problem. And that's when you need to be more discerning about the use of technology, because that's when it becomes more dangerous. So time, distance are some of the most important things. And in your case, you actually use devices that shield. And that's smart thing to do as well.
Yeah, this is one of them. I just, for the viewers watching YouTube, this is one of them that I use on my laptop. So if I'm using a laptop, a lot of the time I have it sat on this device, which kind of helps scramble the EMF,
Right.
from my understanding.
Yeah, exactly. So there's really things you can do that helps you in a changing environment. But one thing's for sure, don't wait for someone else to protect you. There's no question that there's activity in the open domain, and organizations responsible for ensuring your health are not necessarily providing that kind of filtering for things that are entering our environment. But that's not that terribly unusual. Trans fats. 35 years ago, there was a lowly biochemist who said, the eggs aren't killing us. It's the trans fats you're putting in my margarine. It's the trans fats you're putting in my French fries that are killing me. It took 35 years before it was banned. Why did it take so long? It was in our environment, and there's been collateral damage because of it. So I really do believe that's why the onus is on you to worry about taking actions, not on someone else.
Yeah, that's entirely right. You know what, if I think back, for instance, like the food pyramid, you know, when I was a kid, we were all told, you know, don't have your bacon and eggs, or don't have any fats at breakfast. You know, you should go for your cornflakes or your frosted flakes,
Right.
which basically was like having a dessert for breakfast. And then that would lead to a craving later on in a day, and we'd have the white bread, we'd have the grains. And, you know, then we're creating insulin resistance. And it wasn't until years later we realized, oh, wow, we got it all wrong. It's the healthy fats that are actually good for us. And this is possibly creating insulin resistance, obesity, and all sorts of health implications. So to get it right, then we should make sure that that Wi-Fi router is further away, the phone is further away. One thing that I do, and I assuming you suggest as well, that they put their phone on airplane mode when they don't need it, especially at night, or switch it off altogether and keep these devices out of the bedroom.
No question. You do not want anything in the bedroom, not even on the outside walls, because the Wi-Fi will go right through that wall. You really got to be conscious about where your transmitters are, where those bees are, particularly with sleep. And we've talked about it already, but I want to reinforce the circadian rhythm. When you have the blue light on and the melatonin is disrupted, it's not just that. There's also parts of the brain that are connected to the mitochondrial function. And it needs that brain supporting the recovery of that cell. And when you have those exposures when you're sleeping, my goodness me, it's definitely hampering your resilience, your recovery, and you need it when you break down your stump muscles to perform.
Of course. All right. Okay. So, well, thank you ever so much for that explanation. And I know that because I've read your book, Radiation Nation, that we have just, you know, basically gone onto the surface of what is behind here. So anybody interested in reading Daniel DeBraun's book, which I have read and I suggest, please check out the link in our show notes. It is it's an easy read, but it's a great read. And obviously you have some awesome products that I've been using for quite a while now. I've got this phone case here, and the blanket as well that I know everybody has seen on my socials, and lots of other products as well. And we have 20% off for all of our listeners listening to this episode. And if you go into the show notes, you'll see the link there to the products, and you can put in Gethin, Gethin, to get that 20% off. Thank you very much for providing us with that discount, by the way. And thank you ever so much for being a part of this podcast, sir.
Ken, thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, everybody, that is another episode of the Knowledge and Mileage podcast. If you do like this, please let us know by leaving a review below and sharing with others. We are out.